All right, so we've got our very basic ground and character moving about on that ground. I think we should spend just a minute or two adding some color, adding some materials. So I'm just going to give my cube a material. So over here in the materials tab, by default, because this is the default cube, it already has a material added here. If we select the ground which we spawned in with Shift A, you can see there's no material here in the list of options. But the cube has this base color, this white base color, which kind of appears grey due to our lighting, but we'll play about with that in a minute. So the easiest way to adjust the color of an object is to add the material in, which we'll do for a second for the ground, and then change the base color. So I'm going to go for a nice pink. And it's not showing in the 3D view because at the moment we are using this solid viewport shading option. If we change to a rendered viewport shading, we will see how the game would look when we play it, when it's rendered. All right, so we've got a pink color for our cube, and I'm just going to name it. In fact, I think I'll name it player. It's very good practice to name your objects, materials, and then we can reuse them later on. You don't end up with hundreds of materials, a different material for each object. Right, so our ground doesn't have anything yet, so we have to add it in manually. So we just click new to add a new material, and let's call it ground, and then we'll change the base color to green. So you may have noticed I quite like a pink and green color scheme. The base, when you click on the base color swatch here, we're given a color wheel, and just for your information, opposites on the color wheel are known as complementary colors, so they will go together quite nicely. So yellow and blue complement each other, green and pink complement each other quite nicely. So we've got some very basic, and actually while we're at it, let's have a look at how we can add different materials to different parts of one mesh. So if I just go in edit mode on my ground here and face select mode and just select this bottom face, and I'm just going to extrude it down so that then I'm given some more geometry to play with. And if I do Alt and left click on that edge to select that whole loop of faces, and then shift select the bottom one, I'll add a new material with the little plus here, add a new material slot, and then add a new material to that slot, and we'll call this ground 2. So we're going to have 2, or we can just call it brown because I'm going to make it brown. So we'll choose a sort of orangey color. So this is our colors. This is where we choose our hues, and this is where we can decide how light or dark that hue is. So we'll just drag the slider down so that it's no longer orange, but more of a brown color. And then what we need to do at this point is click assign, and it will apply that material to those faces that I have selected. Okay, so when you want to add materials, multiple materials to different parts of the mesh, you would need to select the face that you want to apply the material to, select the material, and then click assign. Okay, so in this case, if I deselect it, now I've got the brown on the top. I don't want that, so we'll switch back to the green. Okay, click assign, and it's back to the green. So back in rendered shading, you can see that we can't really see that brown, and that's just to do with the lighting that we have here. By default, the lamp that we have, if we go into the lamp settings, so it's switched for us, we've got a point lamp. All these lamps, point, sun, spot, and area lamps, all have slightly different properties and different behaviors. So for example, a point lamp just kind of emits light in all directions. If I hit G and Y and move it along in the y-axis, and then G and Z, and it's for some reason stopped the screencast keys again. So if I move this lamp closer, you can see that the reason I'm not seeing the brown is because the edges of this ground plane are in shadow. They're in shadow. So if I wanted to, see that color, I would need to sort out my light situation. I think I'm just going to leave a very basic point lamp in the scene. I'll maybe move it back to the center roughly. So I'll just go into a top view and move it into the center. That's probably fine for now. We'll maybe come back and adjust lights later on. All right, so we'll move on very quickly to adding in some collectible objects then. And what I've just noticed is because we moved our ground plane down, it's quite a bit lower than the center of the 3D view. So when we spawn objects in at this 3D cursor, they're going to be quite high in comparison to our ground. So I'm just going to select these two objects, shift selecting, hitting G and Z, just moving them up so that the ground plane is a little bit closer, the top of the ground plane is a little bit closer to the 3D cursor. And I'm going to add a cylinder to create a quick coin. So I'll do Shift A, mesh, cylinder, and we've got a cylinder. When you first add in an object, you get the properties of that object here in a little flyout menu. This is the first well, this is the only time that you can adjust the resolution, the geometry within that, in terms of how many vertices it's made of. You can see this cylinder has 32 verts around the edge. So it's quite handy to know that that exists. If I change that to 8, for example, we'll get a much more low poly cylinder. So I'm just going to flatten it with with S and Z, and then I'm going to rotate it around on the X-axis by 90 degrees, so RX 90, and just scale it down a little bit. And let's add a little material to our coin as well. So we'll create new material. And actually for this one, I'd like our coins to have a little bit of a glow to them. So I'm going to switch our logic editor to the shader editor. You've got all sorts of settings here for, if you want to make a basic material. In the material tab, you've got all sorts of settings that you can play with. But actually, the standard practice for editing materials would be to use the shader editor. So I thought it might be a good time to introduce you to that. So just going up to the little drop-down menu at the top left-hand side of our logic editor, if we switch to the shader editor, we'll see the node for this basic principled BSDF material. And what I'm actually going to do is delete that one and switch it out for an emission shader. So just hit X to delete that shader, Shift A to add a new one. I'm going to do a search and search for emission. Okay, and we just link up this point here, the output of the emission shader to the input of our material output shader. Change the color to yellow, it makes sense. And if we turn on over here in the render settings, if we tick bloom, that should give us a bit of a glow. If I turn the strength up a little bit, you should be able to see it. Okay, so we've swapped out our basic material here for an emission type material, and we turned on bloom in the render settings down here. And there are a few settings you can play with if you want to get a bit more advanced, but that'll do for now. So let's detect collisions and collect these coins. So done with materials for the time being. We'll switch back to the Logic Bricks editor. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a kind of label to each of these two objects called a property. So in the Logic editor with the cube selected, we're going to add a game property, and we're going to call this game property player. We're going to select our coin, add a game property, and call that coin. And then what we're going to do is detect a collision with the player. So we're going to select the coin, and we're going to use a collision sensor, and we're going to use the property option. So we're on the coin, we're going to say detect a collision with that player label, and the syntax has to be accurate. So I've got a capital P, which needs to be used here. So what's going to happen when we detect a collision with the player? We're going to have an edit object actuator that's going to end the object. So it will disappear. The coin will disappear when it detects a collision with the player. All right, so let's just check that. It's looking a little bit high. So just move it down a bit to ground level. Just pop into camera view so I know which way is front. Press P, and there the coin disappears. So that would be fine. We could select that coin and duplicate it a couple of times. Shift D, and again, Screencast keys have stopped. And that would be fine, but if we wanted to at some point edit that coin, we would have to do it 3 times. If we decided that there was too much of a glow or not enough, or we wanted to change the color, or add some animation, we would have to do that 3 times. And if we had 25 coins, we'd have to do it 25 times. So we're going to do something slightly more sensible and spawn these coins in with the use of an empty. So Shift A, and we'll add in an object called an empty. Doesn't matter what version you use, how the empty looks. The empty is essentially just an empty object. It's just an object that we can use to attach scripts to, attach logic to, spawn objects out. There's all sorts of things that we can do with empties, but they're ultimately just invisible objects. We press play, that empty is invisible. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this empty to spawn in the coin. So just like we used the edit object actuator for detecting collisions, we'll use it for spawning the object in as well. So we're going to use an always sensor. So this empty is always going to be adding an object, and that object is going to be our cylinder. And really, I should have named that cylinder coin, but that will do for the time being. Okay, so the empty will always add the object cylinder. Now, this is where Blender gets a little bit quirky. It won't work when I press play. That's because the coin needs to be in a separate collection. So over here in the outliner, you can see that all the objects are in this main collection, which if I just rename level 1, what we need to do is put the coin in a different collection and hide it, and then it will spawn in. So if we select our coin and press M, we can choose to move to a new collection. Ibbles, collect ibbles, abbles, that'll do. So we're moving that coin to a new collection. So you can see, yeah, it's definitely not, that's not how you spell it. So you can see we've got a new collection in our main scene collection called collectibles, and the cylinder is in there. It still won't work because we need to hide it. This is a strange little quirk, but that's just how it works. So now that coin adds in at the empty. Now you can see it's messed around with my with the rotation a little bit. I'm not entirely sure why. So let's see what we can do there. Perhaps if I Control S, no, that saves. How do we apply scale? Control A. So what I'm going to do is apply rotation. I'm going to apply the rotation. I'll show you what that's actually going to do. I don't know if this will even work, but if you look at the item, you can see it's been rotated by 90 degrees from its kind of default position of 0 degrees. If you remember when I initially added the cylinder, I rotated it by 90 degrees. So it may be that if I do Control A and apply rotation, hide it again, it now spawns in at the correct. So the empty is using its original rotation value. So I just kind of returned the cylinder. I've just said this is now my cylinder's rotation. Don't use the. It's a little bit complicated, but the more you apply scale and apply rotation and so on, the more you'll kind of understand what's going on. So that was just Control A, and I've applied the rotation, and it's zeroed out the rotation values. It's no longer rotated by 90 degrees. Blender thinks that at 0, 0, 0 degrees rotation, this is what it should look like. Anywho, now I can duplicate my empties and scatter them about the scene as I wish. And as long as the coin is in a separate collection and hidden, when we press play, that coin will be spawned in at our empties, and we'll be able to pick them up. So you can see if I, for whatever reason, wanted to edit the material or any of its properties. Then that will be updated, and then hide it. That will be updated across all the objects that are spawned in at that empty. So that's pretty handy to know. Okay, so we'll leave that there and we'll move on to what we're going to move on to next. We'll make the coin spin round a little bit. We'll maybe add some sound so that when you collect the coin, you get some audio feedback, and start thinking about how we're going to add a value to a score variable.